Hello YouTube, it's Ewan Jones. I'm joined today by the author JP Tate, also known as James Tate. I interviewed James before and we spoke about his fiction work. Today we're going to be speaking about his non-fiction books, Feminism is Sexism and Progressing Towards the Edge of a Cliff, Understanding Multiculturalism. So James, how's it going?
Not bad. Enjoyed it last time. I'm hoping I'm going to enjoy it this time too.
Excellent, good stuff. So, with your non-fiction work, what was it that got you into, that persuaded you to start writing these books?
My whole life, really. I was mentioning last time that we spoke that my life has kind of paralleled multiculturalism and feminism from the second wave onwards. So this is something I've lived with all my life. And you get to the point where you just want to have your say. Nobody may be listening, but you still want to have your say, right? And fortunately, these days, with the technology we've got, it's possible for the ordinary person to write a book or to do a YouTube video, and you have a chance to have your say. So really, that's all I'm doing with my writing. I'm saying, well, I've lived through 50 years of this. This is what I think. I don't claim any more than that.
Okay, yes. So, I mean, it was, when did you start writing? Because the first one you wrote was Feminism is Sexism. So, when did you embark on this book?
Well, because I'd been wanting to write for years, but I was busy working. But then I got made redundant. So, after I was redundant, I thought, right, now's the time, I'll write a few books. So, Feminism and Sexism was one of those that I wrote. That was I wrote it kind of end of 2013, beginning of 2014, something like that.
Sure.
Whereas Progressing Towards the Edge of a Cliff is the most recent. That was last year's book.
Right.
And it means that I've now got a book on feminism and a book on multiculturalism, which is, as you know, my prevailing preoccupations in everything I write.
Right.
So now I've got one book for each.
And in terms of your life before that, you were working in academia, wasn't it?
I spent over 20 years in academia, yeah, which is why I have such a low opinion of academia.
Right.
But yeah, I used to do philosophy. That was my subject, and used to teach philosophy and so on. But really, that doesn't directly relate to my writing, except insofar as I tend to be quite analytical. That's the kind of the philosophical element of it. But when I write, I don't write for academics, and I don't write academic books because I tend to view academics as irredeemable.
Yes.
If you meet an academic, they're so totally committed to the current political orthodoxy, and they have been all their lives, and they make their living at it. As academics, they have to be committed to feminism, they have to be committed to multiculturalism, they have to support identity politics. That really, you can't ever get them to change their mind because it would require them to admit that their whole lives have been a sham, that they've spent their whole lives believing something that isn't true. Feminism is the most sexist ideology in the world, right? But how could you ever get a feminist to admit it? It would invalidate her life, right? So I tend to view academics as being irredeemable, and I don't write for them, I write for the ordinary reader. Any intelligent person will be able to read my books, follow the arguments, and see the truth in what I'm saying.
And so with your experience of working in philosophy, I've had experience of university, but from the perspective of a student. With that, what I found in my last course, which ended the end of 2012, was that it seemed to be there was a lot of emphasis was put on following orders and on, ticking all of the boxes that you needed to tick, and almost no emphasis at all on actually questioning ideas, on engaging in free thought. That just seemed to be non-existent. It was kind of all about chasing the grades, and in order to do that. It was just an advanced exercise in box ticking. That was my experience of it, and that's what turned me off the pursuing any further involvement with any academic institution.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that people have to understand now is that things are not what they used to be.
Yeah.
So people still have this idea that academia is a place that has kind of intellectual authority. But if you look at the way research is done, especially in the humanities, it's all advocacy research. So they know in advance, because they've got a political agenda, they know in advance what they want their findings to be, and then they set about trying to prove what they already believe. And whereas real research, you go in willing to find out that you might be wrong. You know, and really, for me today, these days, it may be different in the empirical sciences, but in the humanities, like academia no longer has that kind of intellectual authority. And this idea that universities are places where you go and to be challenged by new ideas and to discover new thoughts and new perspectives on the world, all of that is gone, right? I mean, especially in America, but elsewhere as well. You know, there is a rigid orthodoxy. It's more like a seminary, a religious seminary, where you've got a received truth, and you must believe the received truth. You know, and anything else is heresy and apostasy. Right? You know, so universities now they've become the opposite of what they used to be. They used to be the bastions of freedom of speech. Now they're the places where freedom of speech is seen as a bad thing, and everybody has to be platformed. You know? So it's important now for people to get up to date with what the current situation is, instead of thinking that things are still the way they used to be, because they're not. So, I mean, that's why with something like feminism, if we do feminism first, right?
Let's get into that.
We do feminism, then we do multiculturalism.
Sure,
okay?
sure.
With feminism, there's libraries full of feminist books. Huge amounts of verbiage, huge amounts of obfuscation, and it's all written in an academic style, so people think it must have some merit, right? But what I do in my writing is I just bring a bit of common sense to the argument, right? And you can smash great big holes in all this academic obfuscation with a few salient points that come from the real world, right? So, and one of the things I do in the book is have a look at patriarchy theory, and there's various versions of patriarchy theory. Right? But I mean, the essential position for all feminists is that men oppressed women. Right? The essential feature, the foundation stone of feminism is patriarchy theory, that women were oppressed by men. Men were an oppressor class, women were an oppressed class. Right? And that's so easy to disprove. It's almost laughable that they've been able to get away with it for 50 years. Right? If you look at actual history and actual gender roles, one of the things that's different in the last few decades from the whole of human history that went before is that now women can compete on an equal playing field with men. Right? And there's two reasons for that, neither of which is feminism. They're both changes to the material circumstances in people's lives. That's the contraceptive pill, a reliable oral contraceptive, so that women can have sex without getting pregnant, right? Because all through history, you know,
not the case.
Not the case, right? And the other thing is the level of technology that you now have in the workplace. All through history, most jobs were physical labor. So, you know, most jobs were muscle jobs, right? If you look at the communist flag, they've got two tools on that flag. One is a hammer and one is a sickle. Now, the hammer represents the urban proletariat, and the sickle represents the agrarian peasants, right? But they're both muscle tools, a hammer and a sickle, right? That represents the workers. Yeah? If you were to do a flag today to represent the workers, what would be the tool that you would pick? Now, I would say you'd pick a computer keyboard. That's the most ubiquitous tool in workplaces, the computer keyboard. And pregnant women can use computer keyboards as well as the strongest man. Muscles are irrelevant, right? So, especially like young people these days, they're judging history from a perspective of how things are now. You have to remember how things were then. Yeah? So, I mean, right from prehistory, women were disadvantaged in being less strong, having less endurance, and also from being pregnant all the time. Right? So in a world in which most jobs were physical labor, and a lot of the jobs were really hard physical labor. I mean, if you think of a seaman on board a sailing ship, and you know he's out there in all weathers, his fingers are frozen, and he's hauling on the ropes with frozen fingers. Then he's got to climb up the rigging, and you know if his frozen fingers let go, he'll fall to his death. Or if you're a coal miner, so you crawl or crouch for a quarter of a mile to get to the coal face.
Yes.
When you get there, it's a 3-foot coal face. So you spend your working day stripped naked because it's so hot, covered in coal dust, right? Kneeling on the ground, leaning over to the side with your pickaxe, hacking at a 3-foot seam. Now, some jobs were like incredibly, brutally hard, but an awful lot of jobs, even harvesting and things, the hammer and the sickle, the average job was the kind of job that women couldn't compete with men. These days, if you want to dig up the roads and lay a cable, you have a great big machine to do it for you, right? But in the past, you had pickaxes and shovels. When they built the underground, they did it with pickaxes and shovels, you know, in the underground in London.
Yes, yeah.
So, you know, in the past, if women had to compete with men on a level playing field, women would have starved. And if women starve, it means that children die, you don't get the next generation, right? The only way to have the next generation, to have the children grow up and become adults, is to keep the women alive. And so that became the central focus of gender roles. The essential male gender role was to provide for women. Yeah. If a man...
Yeah, that's very much the biological origin of our particular species, isn't it?
You can see it comes from evolution. It comes from prehistory. But when civilization is invented and people settle down, it becomes socialized, and it becomes like you get social norms that reflect the evolutionary inheritance, right? Now, if you've got the male gender role is to keep women alive, to provide for women, to make sure that women don't starve, right? How can that be the role of the oppressor? Right? Yeah.
It's so stupid.
Yeah, right. Like you've got the oppressor working for the oppressed. You've got the oppressor keeping the oppressed alive because the oppressed is more precious than the oppressor is. And it's the same with men protecting women, which is another aspect of the traditional male gender role. You know, men have to put themselves in harm's way in order to keep women safe. Men have even laid down their lives in order to keep women alive. Right? You know, this is not what an oppressor class does. If you're the slave owner, you don't die to keep your slaves alive. Right? If you're the slave owner, you don't work all your life to provide food for the slaves. Right?
Yes.
So it's ludicrous to suggest that men were an oppressor class and women an oppressed class, because the fundamentals of the gender roles were actually in the interests of women more than in the interests of men. Because, you know, if you hadn't had gender roles, that generation of men could have worked, provided for themselves, died, and that would be the last generation, right?
More in the interests of keeping that particular tribe alive as well. So you're creating, you're bringing resources to women. They then have kids, and the resources are filtered onto the kids as well, and so you have the circle of life.
Yeah, that's the crucial thing. Because the men would have lived their lives and died, but the women would have died much sooner because they wouldn't have been able to compete with the men. But the crucial thing is that society ends, and it's society that requires that men provide for women. Right? So it's not like men deciding on gender roles. There was no men deciding on gender roles. Society requires certain gender roles from people, or did do in the past. Right? And men had to fulfill their responsibility to women because, as you say, the tribe would have died out, society would have died out. Yeah. So the idea that you can describe that in terms of oppressor and oppressed is really intellectually dishonest.
I find it one of the most destructive historical lies I think I've ever heard, this patriarchy myth. I mean, for me, it's right up there with Holocaust denial in terms of destructive lies, and well, unlike Holocaust denial, you have vast swathes of the
It's the
population
orthodoxy.
and the mainstream media and
Millions
the
and
government and all the other arms of government all promoting this incredibly toxic lie.
Yeah, and millions of people believe this because it is the orthodox belief. It's the status quo belief, right? And yet what we've said already shows how it's based on an absurdity. So, we might ask, well, like, how is feminism going to defend this? How can feminism convince people of this rubbish, right? And they try in various ways, and every way fails. One example of patriarchy theory is to claim that men ruled society. That men were in the positions of power. Men were the politicians. Men were the CEOs of corporations. Men were the big businessmen and the kings and so on, right? That the political power was mostly held by men, right? And they claim that men ruled society as a result. But this is a straightforward logical error, right? If I give you two propositions that appear to mean the same thing, but don't, right? First proposition, men ruled society. Second proposition, the people who ruled society are men, right? Were men. Right? Now, that second proposition, the people who ruled society were men, that's true, right? It means that the particular individuals who were ruling society were, for the most part, male. But that's not the same as saying that men ruled society, because men is a whole gender of people. The vast majority of men who ever lived, in their billions, lived utterly powerless lives politically. They had no say in anything. They were peasants, they were serfs, they were slaves, they were factory fodder. Right? The idea that these lowly people somehow wielded political power makes, is a nonsense if you look at actual history. Yeah? So, although it's true that the individual people who were ruling were men, it is not true that men ruled society, because most men didn't. You can see the logical error if you take another example. So if we say that the people who ruled society wore shoes, well, that's true. But it's not true that people who wore shoes ruled society, because most people who wore shoes didn't rule society.
Yes.
Yeah. So the people who ruled society were men, but men did not rule society. Right? Because men is a much larger category of people than the people who rule society, who are a tiny minority of men. Yeah? And yet feminism relies upon the equivocation between the two, of pretending that, well, if the people in office are men, that must mean that men rule society. It's like saying that since the current Prime Minister is a woman, the First Minister of Scotland is a woman, the First Minister of Northern Ireland is a woman, clearly women rule society. Yeah? Because the people in office are women. Yeah? It's that kind of mistake.
Just generally with the patriarchy theory, it's it seems to be so much of the negative, I suppose, the bitterness that is created within, I'd say certainly the left wing now, and certainly within the whole identity politics movement. Is this emphasis on an oppressor group and an oppressed group, and then this idiotic reductionistic view of history where the oppressor group has always lorded it over the oppressed group, and the oppressed group has always suffered under the heel of the oppressor group, and everything is just reduced to that. So with the patriarchy myth, it's the same thing. And I've had a number of discussions about, for instance, this year is the centenary of women and men obtaining the vote in the UK, so the centenary of universal suffrage. And the feminists have just turned that into, women obtained the vote 100 years ago. Men obviously always had the vote before that.
Yeah.
And also, if you watch, say, the film Suffragette, I didn't actually see the film. I read the plot synopsis, and in that, it's you just hear one story after another about how all men are scum, and they're all like beating and abusing these poor women, and not giving them equal pay, and all of this stuff. And then the women have to become violent towards the men in order to gain the vote. And it's like, that's not how it happens, because if women were to become violent against men, it probably, and men were these scumbags who just beat up and abused women, then that situation would not result in women winning anything. Instead, the scumbags would just become violent, and you know, it would result in even more chaos and even more violence acted against the women. But that's not what history has shown us at all. And the actual history is that men have always been supportive of women. It's never been okay to beat or rape or abuse a woman. It's always been considered, you know, utterly unmanly to beat or rape a woman. There's always been consequences, and feminists pretend that there weren't, and that in the past, you know, men were like this, and there was no consequences. I'll let you jump in.
Well, one of the things about what you're saying is that it's a way in which feminism disproves itself. Right? Feminism is such a stupid theory that it's actually self-refuting. And I'll explain on the basis of what you're saying, right? And another of the ways in which feminism presents patriarchy theory is that men oppressed women through violence and the threat of violence, because men had muscles and women didn't, right? And this idea is like really crazy, because if that were true, right? If men oppressed women through violence and the threat of violence, feminism would not exist. Right? The suffragettes would have been found floating in the River Thames. You know, when second wave feminism come along, all those famous feminists, Germaine Greer and people like that, you know, they would all have been attacked. You know, in the same way that, you know, Salman Rushdie had to go into hiding when they declared a fatwa on him. You know, that would have happened to the feminists if men were these violent thugs who rule women and oppress women through violence and the threat of violence. And as you say, that never happens. And and I've lived through this, so if you look through the last 50 years, I've never once heard a television news broadcast that said there was a feminist march through London today, and 37 women were taken to hospital because they were attacked by violent misogynists in a counter-demonstration. Right? There's never counter-demonstrations to feminist marches. Right? I've never known of a case where there was like a feminist rally in Trafalgar Square, and a violent group of men turned up with their placards and started punching the women in the face, breaking their noses and knocking their teeth out. Right? This never happens. I've never heard of, you know, a gang of men rushing into a feminist bookstore and trashing the place because they don't want feminist bookstores. Right? Men have not used violence against feminism at all. Right? Whereas if feminism were right about what men are like, if men are these testosterone-fueled creatures who hate women and oppress women through violence, feminism would have been crushed. Right? But the opposite is true. There's a famous, I'm sure you've seen it, a famous clip on YouTube. It's at a Warren Farrell event. Yeah, I think it's in Canada, University of Canada. And there's this little feminist there, and she's like attacking this guy verbally. She's like, you fucking scum, you fucking scum, you fucking scum, right in his face, over and over, you fucking scum. Right? And does the guy hit her? No. The guy's standing there biting his lip, trying to be patient. Right? Men exercise enormous self-restraint because, as you say, it's always been part of the male gender role that you must not hit women. That, you know, women are the special ones that you must protect. You mustn't hit them, you must protect them. You treat them like children. They're delicate. They're precious, right? And of course, that little feminist knows that perfectly well. That's why she's so confident. That's why she's so brave, so courageous as to scream abuse into this man's face, because she knows perfectly well that she's got female privilege. She's got the female privilege that men mustn't hit women. Yeah? And that's a classic example of feminist doublethink. Because if you were to ask that little feminist, do men oppress women by violence? She would say yes, and she would believe it. She would be completely sincere. Yes, men use violence to oppress women. And yet at the same time, she knows that it's perfectly safe for a little woman like her to scream, you are fucking scum, over and over again into a man's face, because there's no way he's going to hit a woman. Right? That's doublethink. Right? So, I mean, what you've got is the fact that the existence of feminism and the success of feminism is like so powerful. It's been part of the establishment for the last 40 years, right? Part of the political establishment. It rules in education. It's an enormous success. It's thriving. But it couldn't exist if men were what feminism says men are. The fact that it does exist proves that men are not what feminism says men are. In other words, the very existence of feminism disproves what feminism says about men. That's a self-refuting theory. Yeah? And it's, you have to be spectacularly stupid to have a theory that disproves itself.
And there's a profound indecency then at the core of it, because it is built on this disgusting lie. And so in order to start promoting it, to start promoting these positions, to actually get into a situation like this woman did at this Canadian university, where she was screaming at this guy. She didn't know that he was effing scum because he was attending an event that she didn't like.
Yeah.
There's just this incredible hatred at the heart of that. And I find this this hatred is quite prevalent, in culture, and it's certainly spread by the feminist movement.
Well, there's a remarkable level of self-deception too, what I would call intellectual dishonesty. So, I mean, another argument that they put forward for patriarchy, because men didn't rule society and men didn't rule women through violence, right? So another argument they put forward is the idea that although the people in power were not all men, there was only some men in power, nonetheless they ruled in a male interest. This is another version of patriarchy theory, right? And you can see the projection in this, right? Because whenever feminists are in power, all of their efforts are to try to benefit women. They don't give a damn about anybody else, just women, right? And they project that onto men. They think that since feminists in power are only concerned to benefit women, when men are in power, they must be only concerned to benefit men. Now, this is not true. If you look at history, male politicians didn't serve a male interest. It's just feminism projecting onto them. And what makes this so remarkably self-deceiving is that if it were true, as feminism says, that men in the past in positions of power served a male interest, it would negate all of the politics of history. It would mean, for example, that there'd be no reason for a Bolshevik revolution, because if Lenin was in power, he wouldn't represent the proletariat, he'd represent men, he'd be serving a male interest. And if the Tsar's in power, he wouldn't be representing the aristocracy, he'd be representing men, he'd be serving a male interest. So if both Lenin and the Tsar, as men in power, both represent a male interest, why would they have a revolution? Right? It would mean that the Indian nationalism of Gandhi Gandhi's politics was nothing to do with Indian nationalism. Gandhi was a man in power. He served a male interest. So Winston Churchill he wouldn't need to oppose Gandhi's Indian nationalism, because like Gandhi, Winston Churchill would be serving a male interest. Fidel Castro and Richard Nixon, they would have the same politics. They're both men in power. They'd both be serving a male interest. Right? In order to believe that, you have to, as it were, erase all of the actual politics of history.
Yes.
So if you've got William of Orange serving the Protestant cause, and you've got Louis XIV serving the Catholic cause, no, you've got to erase that from history. William of Orange and Louis XIV, both men in power, both serving a male interest. It's a nonsense.
The Greek philosophers, just talking about the male interest.
Yeah, it means that all the actual real politics of history, the liberalism and the Marxism,
all the plays of Shakespeare, all just about serving the male interest.
The nationalism and everything, right? All of that is erased for this unbelievably crude feminist view that it was just about men serving a male interest to oppress women. Right? It removes politics from history, effectively.
Yes, I see the same thing with a lot of the, like the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, and a lot of the ideas about white privilege and, a lot of this kind of recent promotion of racism by the mainly the left wing, and yeah. So with that, it reduces everything to just the racial issue, and then it takes culture out of the question, and it also takes actual history out of the question as well. Because if you look at the actual history of the world, what you see is that pretty much every group of people have enslaved either people within their own community or people within external communities.
Yeah.
So, you know, that was basically the role of the serfs here in the UK within the feudal system. They were slaves, you know, within, you go back to the Greek and Roman era, they were enslaving their own people as well as people from captured regions, or, you know, regions where their armies were taken over. And yeah, you know, like we say that the Barbary slave trade as well, that was one of the most gruesome slave trades that the world has ever seen, and it was run by the Muslims. So all of this is just ignored, and it's all reduced to the issue of, oh yeah, well, there's all of these white people who have positions in power and positions of influence, and they're all just racist against black people all the time. And even when they're not being, you know, externally racist, it's they're using unconscious bias against them. So, you know, you have to look at the way that white person opened the door. That was a racist way they opened the door, you know, and the way they only smiled at that black person for 1 second. If they had their smile had lingered just a bit more, then they wouldn't have been racist. But the way they did it was racist. So it's just this idiotic reductionism of everything to, you know, these, I suppose, natural fault lines between different groups of people. So, you know, in that case, between white people and black people, and in the case of feminism, between men and women. And just the brushing aside of everything that actually happened in history, and all of the movements that we've been part of, and the culture that existed, say, within the United Kingdom or any other country in the world that contributed to our history and where we are today. It's all just being erased, isn't it, in the name of identity politics.
And in a way, they have to do that, because if they want this like massively oversimplified worldview, where there's goodies and there's baddies, and we can identify this group as the goodies and that group as the baddies, you really do have to airbrush reality out of history, right? So, I mean, and another approach to patriarchy theory is for them to say, well, like, men may not have had all the political power as a class, and maybe men didn't oppress women by violence, but one of the things that men did was to keep paid employment for themselves. Like, men had access to paid employment to a much greater extent than women did, and this meant that men were financially independent. So whilst a woman had to wait around for some man to propose marriage to her, men could go out there and do great things and be independent and have much more power and autonomy, right? Now we know the real reason why men had greater access to paid employment is because it's necessary if men are to have financial responsibility for women. If men have a gendered role where they must support women, then men must have access to the paid employment to be able to do that, right? So that's the real reason. But they present this as if this were male power, right? Like men had this greater autonomy. But it, as you say, it involves a huge airbrushing of history, because this is a perspective that comes from middle-class, affluent women, especially feminist academics, affluent middle-class women, right? You know, when they look around their social circle, the men they see occupy positions of status and high salary, high status jobs. You know, they're working in a university and they want to be a professor. And why are all the professors men? Why aren't there more female professors, right? Or like the glass ceiling. Oh, how often have we heard about the glass ceiling? It's all about the upper echelons, right? Even Hillary Clinton said in her presidential campaign that that was the ultimate glass ceiling. They're still talking about
maybe
it now.
these women should start dating homeless guys if
Well,
they want to feel good about their status relative to their partners.
Right. But feminism is a ruthlessly middle class ideology. It comes right out of the female middle class. So they have no conception of like working class men. Working class men are just the people who empty their dustbins. They don't even see them. They take them for granted. So their view of paid employment is that you get a career and it's very rewarding and self-fulfilling and people respect you and so on. Whereas for almost all men throughout history, work has been this odious, arduous chore, painful, hard work that you have to do. You have to force yourself to do it because you've got to earn money to pay for the wife and kids. You've got to work to earn a living to keep your family alive, right? And once you look at it that way, and we're talking about most men, right? That idea of male supremacism is really an idea of mule supremacism. Men are the mule that pulls the cart, right? They're not sitting in the cart driving the mule. They're not the capitalists who own the products that are being transported in the cart. Men are the beast of burden. Men are the mule that's pulling the cart along. They're the mass of hard-working men, right? So this version of patriarchy theory takes that mule and says that mule was in charge. That mule had all the power, right? Whereas, and to do that, of course, you can only do that if you just ignore the reality of the lives of billions of men all across the world, all throughout history. Mm-hmm. Most men don't have high status, high income jobs, and they never did have.
Most jobs, even today, aren't particularly fulfilling, I'd say. Yeah. It's more about having to perform an obligation, and by doing that, you create value, which is useful because that benefits other people, and then you get rewarded for creating that value. And for a lot of people, a lot of jobs are relatively mundane, or kind of there's quite a lot of pressure on, in some cases physically arduous. Even today, there's a lot of physically arduous jobs that are performed by men. All of the say sewage work jobs, guys who are off on North Sea oil rigs. A lot of the farming jobs and construction work, where I believe that's the highest rate of work-related fatalities. Yeah. And so, the feminists, I think, like to pretend the workplace is safe, and that, in a way, that it's about entitlement, and specifically their entitlements. Like, that seems to be the whole mindset behind this idea that there needs to be 50-50 in all of the trades that they want, and that women need to be paid as much as all of these other men. It's this mindset of entitlement, but you're applying that to the workplace, where entitlement is actually completely useless as a mindset, whereas the actual mindset you want is, what value can I create, and how obviously if other people feel that improves their lives, then they'll give me money for doing this job, and then I'll have more money. And so that's the actual mindset you want. How can I create value in my job, and how can I get the money that I can bring back to my family to keep us in the black, and to keep the whole my family basically in a state of order, as opposed to us having to sell our house and then being made bankrupt and all of that. So it's this idiotic attitude, but it seems to be this just larger manifestation of a real brattiness, I'd say, by a lot of women. But it all just applies to this idea, this way of looking at the workplace of, the world owes me a favour, and, the world owes me a job because I have a vagina, and so that's why I'm entitled to all of this.
The reason that feminists think of the workplace as not being a dangerous place is because, of course, theirs aren't. They work in the hygienic jobs, right? No feminist is demanding we must get more women down the sewers. You know, they're quite happy for men to wade through the shit and do those jobs, right? You know, we're not far from the Severn Bridge here, right? There's a little plaque on the Severn Bridge, and it's got the names of 6 men. And they're the men who died building that bridge. Right. Because construction work is really dangerous. Even today, like 9 out of 10 workplace fatalities are men. 90% of workplace fatalities. Right? The Forth Bridge, 78 men died building the Forth Bridge. And this is just part of their work, right? This is part of the cost of building the bridge. You know, it costs so much in time, it costs so much in money, it costs so much in men's lives. And this is history. Yeah, everybody knows about the Twin Towers being knocked down by the jihadis, the World Trade Center. But how many people know that it cost 60 men their lives to build the Twin Towers in the first place? 60 men died. You know, I mean, goodness knows how many hundreds of men must have died building the London Underground and that kind of thing, right? You know. All through history, men dying has been a part of men's jobs. How many seamen died at sea? You know, and I'm talking about the military. I'm talking about the merchant navy. You know, men dying at sea was a commonplace. Right? You know, but from the feminist point of view, they're affluent middle-class women who view everything through that lens. You know, the idea of men suffering and dying just as a part of their ordinary work doesn't feature in their thinking at all.
Yeah, and I find it an incredibly degenerative situation with regards to all feminist policies when applied to the workplace, because it seems the mentality is that, for instance, one of the things we've seen is with the fire service, there was a concern that a lot of women were failing the physical tests needed to become a fireman. Especially the lifting a heavy weight, you know, when you're climbing the ladder, that sort of thing. And so they were lowering the standards needed for these women to pass the test. But then you start applying that to a workplace situation that firemen are going to be involved in, for instance, trying to carry a very heavy person out of a burning house. And does it benefit the organisation that all of these women have been passed through as firemen when they're unable to cope in that situation? So what are they going to do? They're going to look towards a physically stronger man in that situation and say, oh, can you be the one who rescues that guy from the first level living room, you know, and carries him down through the burning wreckage of this house? And so that puts extra pressure on the you know, the physically stronger man in that situation. And it's incredibly negative because what you could have had is a number of, you know, physically strong men in the team, and they're all doing the mule work. They're all, you know, pulling their weight. And, you know, the result of these guys who are physically capable actually performing this role is a heroic act. But now what you're seeing is women being advanced into these positions where they don't deserve to be, because they're unable to fulfill the physical requirements of the role. And this applies in, I'd say, like all physical jobs. And it just seems to be this feminist mentality of, well, you know, we need to have 50-50, and we just need to advance more women into these positions because of gender equality. And it's like, yeah, but there never was any equality in these jobs. You know, either you can do the job or you can't. Either you're suited to the role or you're not. And that's it, you know, and that's the actual determinant of whether you're able to provide value in the workplace or not. So
yeah, I mean, what you're talking about here is the difference between the kind of numerical notion of equality and actual equality. So the 50-50 is just a crude numerical equality, right? But real equality in the workplace is where everyone pulls their own weight, where everyone does an equal job, right? So the firefighters you're talking about, if the women are employed the same as the men, they get the same pay, they're the same status and so on, but there's an expectation that the men will do the heavy work, right? Then they're not getting paid the same rate for the same job, because the men are doing the heavy work and the women aren't. Right? So that's actual gender inequality. Yeah. So if you've got the police force, and women can be chief constables and women can fulfill all the different roles except riot work, because if you do riots, you might get your head bashed in by a protester. Right? That wouldn't be the same work for the same money. That's why whenever there's a riot on television, I always like to spot the women, because you can see them, and there are female riot police, and I'm always pleased to see the women there, because if men are going to get their heads cracked, women should get their heads cracked too. Right? That's the job. Right? Same work for the same money. Right? So it's the difference between a kind of crude numerical notion of equality and real equality, because if you joined a group of men in any job, whether you're digging up the roads or whatever it might be, the other men would expect you to pull your weight. Right? So any kind of physical job like that, a woman can do it, by all means. She's got to pull her weight. She's got to do as much as everybody else. Right?
Yeah, and if that doesn't happen, then your organisation isn't creating any value. So,
and more to the point, women are exploiting men.
Yes,
right? They're using men as their beasts of burden. Oh, you've got big muscles, you do it. Right? That's exploitation.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and I suppose it just seems that this is constantly a mindset that's perpetuated by feminist policy makers and the mainstream media, and then applied to the workplace. And I mean, going back to female academics, say, teaching these feminist mantras, I reckon you see the same thing there, which is just a promotion of these inane ideas of victimization and oppressor groups and oppressed. And what you're not actually doing is creating any intellectual value. You're not engaged in searching for the truth. Instead you're just promoting these power narratives, let's say, and and so I guess these women are writing, oh yeah, we're so oppressed, therefore give me a promotion.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the mentality of it.
I mean, in the world of victimology, you exploit the claim of powerlessness to exercise power, right? So, for example, in was it 2 years ago? There weren't any black people getting Oscars. So someone did a hashtag Oscars so white.
Yeah.
The following year, they're taking black people off the street. Do you want an Oscar? Have you ever been in a film? Have an Oscar. Right? They exercise power by claiming to be powerless. Right? And of course, they get that from feminism. Feminism is the originator of that. The idea that you make the emotional appeal, I am so victimized, do this for me. I am so powerless, give me what I want. Yeah. But I think that can't last forever, right? And I think it's starting to change now. Because, as we've said, feminism has happened parallel with multiculturalism, right? And multiculturalism is going to change feminism. Just been a recent thing I've noticed on the internet about a German feminist who's admitted she was wrong about the migrant crisis because of all the migrants committing rapes and so on, right? The future is not going to be like the past. One of the things that feminists have been taking for granted for the last 30, 40 years is that now that they've got the lovely technological world where muscles don't matter anymore and everybody's using a keyboard, right? That now they don't need men, they'll never need men ever again, right? So they may have needed men for the last 5,000 years. Men may have been protecting and providing women for the last 5,000 years, but women don't need them anymore. So, right, that's it, to hell with men. Men are obsolete. A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle, right? And they've committed themselves totally to this idea that they now, they're not just equal with men, they're better with men. Men are the shit on their shoes, right? But multiculturalism is changing the Western world, Right? And the future is not necessarily going to be like the present. The present is not like the past, so why should the future be like the present? Right? And I think what's going to really hammer feminism is the ongoing process of multiculturalism. So maybe we could move on to multiculturalism.
Yes, yeah. I mean,
right?
yeah. Just to say about feminism is sexism. It's a great book, and it covers all of the major topics that I see, you know, discussed amongst anti-feminist circles. And you know, I found it really the same as the multiculturalism book. It really you know, took a microscope to these ideas and utterly destroyed them. And I think your work achieves that really well. You know, just this kind of microscope where you look at these ideas and then you just utterly annihilate them. And the main idea I think that you take apart in that book is the patriarchy theory. That was the initial part of the book, but then you go on to all of the other areas, like how feminism actually dominates the workspace and policy making decisions within certainly British society, but across the Western world as well. And then you know, focusing on some of the other areas that we see the influence and of this movement, and then just all of the chaos it's caused, really. And I think it's
there's a chapter on, for example, domestic violence and rape and the way they're used as political weapons. There's a lot of arguments in the book. One thing you'll get from any book of mine, especially the non-fiction stuff, is you'll get an argument on every page, right? So there's lots and lots of arguments in there, and I think that if you say like to look at it through a microscope, I think if you look at it through the lens of intelligent common sense, it explodes all the myths.